Girl waves to veteran at Walmart. Military instincts sense something off, so he takes action. It's funny how life can change in the blink of an eye. One moment, you're just another face in the crowd, minding your own business, and the next, you find yourself at the center of something that could alter lives forever. That's exactly what happened to Rick Dawson. One ordinary morning at Walmart. A retired military veteran in his late 60s. Rick wasn't looking for trouble. He never did. But when a little girl named Chloe caught his attention with a shy wave, across the store aisle, something deep inside him stirred. It wasn't the kind of stirring you get from nostalgia or warmth. It was sharper, more urgent. His instincts, honed over decades of service, whispered one clear message. Something is wrong. Rick had always trusted his gut. In the military, that instinct had saved not only his life, but also those of his comrades more times than he cared to count. So when Chloe waved again, this time hesitantly glancing behind her, as though checking if anyone was watching, Rick felt a chill run down his spine. The girl didn't seem scared. Not outright. But there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. That tugged at him. And then there was the man standing near her. At first glance, he looked like any other shopper, casually browsing through cereal boxes. But Rick noticed the way the man kept shifting his weight, his darting eyes scanning the area, too frequently to be casual. Something about the scene didn't sit right. As Rick pushed his cart closer, under the pretense of grabbing a box of oatmeal, he exchanged a quick smile with Chloe. She returned it, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's when he saw it. A faint bruise peeking out from beneath her sleeve. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but to someone like Rick, who'd spent years reading body language and spotting signs of distress, it screamed louder than words ever could. He tried to engage the man in conversation, asking casually if they were waiting for someone. The response was polite enough, but the tension in the air thickened. Rick knew better than to push too hard, so he backed off, for now. Back home later that day, Rick couldn't shake the image of Chloe's face from his mind. He mentioned it to his wife, Margaret, over lunch. "You're probably overthinking it," she said gently, knowing full well how deeply ingrained his protective instincts were. But even Margaret couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, Rick was onto something. After all, their quiet retirement hadn't dulled their ability to care about others. If anything, it had made them more attuned to the world around them. They decided to keep an eye out, just in case. What they didn't realize was that fate would force their hand sooner rather than later. The very next day, while stopping at a gas station on their way to pick up groceries, Rick and Margaret spotted Chloe again. This time sitting alone in a car, parked nearby. Her earlier companion was nowhere to be seen, but the unease in her expression was unmistakable. Before Rick could approach, however, a stranger loomed into view, leaning against the wall outside the convenience store. There was something predatory about the way he scanned the parking lot, his gaze lingering on Chloe's car. Margaret gripped Rick's arm tightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think?" Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched as the stranger lit a cigarette. His movements deliberate, yet calculated. Every fiber of Rick's being told him this wasn't a coincidence. He glanced back at Chloe, whose tiny hands pressed against the window as though she wanted desperately to escape. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't good. Without wasting another second, Rick made a decision. Turning to Margaret, he said firmly, "Stay here. Call the police. I'm going to check on her." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding as she fumbled for her phone. Meanwhile, Rick moved swiftly toward the car, his military training kicking in. As he approached, he called out softly, "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" Chloe turned to look at him. Her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. She nodded weakly. But before Rick could ask anything else, the sound of footsteps behind him made his blood run cold. Spinning around, he came face to face with the stranger from the gas station. The man smirked, holding up a set of keys. "Looking for these?" he asked mockingly, jingling them in the air. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Rick's mind raced, calculating every possible move. He knew he couldn't let this man leave with Chloe. Not without answers. But before he could act, the stranger lunged forward, grabbing Chloe roughly by the arm. Panic surged through Rick's veins as he stepped between them, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside him. "Let her go," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, it seemed like the man might comply, but then everything escalated in ways Rick couldn't have anticipated. Just as the tension reached its peak, sirens wailed in the distance. Margaret's call had worked. Yet instead of backing down, the stranger grew more desperate, pulling Chloe closer and muttering threats under his breath. Rick stood his ground, his eyes locked onto the man's, refusing to back down. Behind him, Chloe whimpered softly, her small frame trembling with fear. And as the police cars screeched to a halt mere feet away, Rick realized this was far from over. Who was this man? Why had he targeted Chloe? And most importantly, what dark secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town? To be continued. Rick's mind raced as he processed what had just happened. The stranger's smirk, the keys jingling in his hand, and Chloe's terrified expression. All of it painted a picture that was far from ordinary. Rick knew better than to let this moment slip away. He took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. "You don't want to do this," he said, his eyes locked onto the man's. For a split second, there was silence, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Then, without warning, the man shoved Chloe toward the car door and lunged at Rick. Margaret watched from a distance, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run to Rick's side, but her legs wouldn't move. Years of arthritis had left her knees weak, and the weight of the situation froze her where she stood. All she could do was clutch her phone tightly, praying the police would arrive in time. Her mind flashed back to earlier that day. The innocent wave at Walmart, the faint bruise on Chloe's arm, the unease she'd felt but couldn't quite explain. None of it made sense until now, as Rick grappled with the stranger. Adrenaline surged through him, like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. His military training kicked in instantly. Every movement calculated, every decision deliberate. But the man was younger, stronger, and desperate. A sharp blow caught Rick off guard, sending him stumbling backward. Pain shot through his ribs. But he forced himself to stay focused. Chloe was still in danger, and that thought alone kept him moving forward. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. The stranger hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. Rick seized the opportunity, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the keys clattered to the ground. Chloe scrambled away, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop running until she reached Margaret. The two of them collapsed into each other's arms, trembling with relief and fear. But the tension wasn't over yet. As the police car screeched to a halt, officers spilled out, guns drawn. The stranger raised his hands slowly, his face twisted with frustration and anger. Rick stepped back, breathing heavily, his body aching from the struggle. He glanced at Margaret and Chloe, ensuring they were safe, before turning his attention to the unfolding scene. It was only then that he noticed something odd about the van parked nearby. Its windows were tinted, but inside, he could make out the faint outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat. "Wait!" Rick called out to the officers, pointing toward the van. One of them nodded, signaling for backup as they approached cautiously. The driver didn't wait for them to get close. With a roar of the engine, the van peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing against the asphalt. Rick cursed under his breath, realizing this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Back at the Parker family's apartment later that evening, the atmosphere was tense. Roy and Evelyn sat together on the couch, their faces pale with exhaustion. Chloe was curled up beside her mother, clutching a stuffed animal like it was a lifeline. Rick and Margaret had joined them, their presence offering some comfort. But the weight of the day hung heavily in the room. No one spoke for a long while, the silence broken only by the occasional sniffle or sigh. Finally, Roy cleared his throat. "We need to talk about what happened," he said, his voice hoarse. "That man, he knew us. He knew our routines, our habits. This wasn't random." Evelyn nodded, her hands trembling as she held on to Chloe. "And those photos on his phone," she added softly. "How did he even get access to our home, to Chloe's school?" Rick leaned forward, his expression grim. "It's possible someone helped him. Someone who knows your schedule, your lifestyle, maybe even someone you trust." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, casting a shadow over the group. Margaret reached for Rick's hand, squeezing it gently. She could see the wheels turning in his head, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. Just then, Chloe stirred, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Triana," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. Everyone turned to look at her, their brows furrowed in confusion. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Evelyn asked, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Chloe hesitated, her lower lip quivering. "Triana," she repeated, a little louder this time. "She was talking to him, at school, before—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Triana, a staff member at Chloe's school, had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the kidnapping. She'd asked Chloe questions about her parents' work schedules, about their vacations, even about the security system at their house. Roy's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "I trusted her," he muttered, his voice laced with betrayal. "She's been with the school for years. How could she—" He stopped abruptly, unable to finish the sentence. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him in the moment. Rick exchanged a glance with Margaret, both of them thinking the same thing. If Triana was involved, then this went deeper than any of them had realized. It wasn't just about money, it was personal. Someone had deliberately targeted the Parkers, using their wealth and status as leverage. And whoever it was, they weren't working alone. The conversation shifted as they discussed their next steps. Roy insisted on calling the school principal, immediately demanding answers. Evelyn, however, was more cautious. "We can't jump to conclusions," she said, though her tone betrayed her own doubts. "We need proof, otherwise we risk making things worse." Rick agreed, adding, "And we need to be careful. If Triana is involved, she might not be the only one. There could be others watching, waiting for us to make a mistake." His words sent a chill through the room, reminding everyone that the danger wasn't over. Not yet. As the night wore on, the group decided to stick together, finding strength in numbers. Roy called the police again, updating them on Chloe's revelation about Triana. Meanwhile, Margaret tended to Chloe, distracting her with stories and gentle reassurances. Rick paced the living room, his mind racing with possibilities. Something about the whole situation didn't add up. Why target Chloe specifically? What was the connection between the kidnappers and the Parker family? Then it hit him. A memory from earlier that week. Rick had been reading the local news online when he came across an article about a recent surge in border crossings. Authorities had warned residents to be vigilant, citing increased criminal activity in the area. Could that be the link? Was this part of a larger operation, one that extended beyond Laredo? Before he could share his thoughts, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the window. A rock lay on the floor, a note tied to it with string. Roy picked it up, his hands shaking as he unfolded the paper. The message was short and chilling. Stay out of it, or the girl pays. For a moment, no one spoke. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around them. Fear mingled with anger, creating a volatile mix that threatened to boil over. Rick stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "They're testing us," he said, "trying to scare us into backing off. But we can't let them win." Roy nodded, his resolve hardening. "If they think we're going to sit here and do nothing, they're wrong." Evelyn hugged Chloe closer, her protective instincts kicking in. "We'll fight back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For our family, for Chloe." As the hours ticked by, the group huddled together, formulating a plan. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they couldn't face it alone. Together, they vowed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, because sometimes the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting, and this was one they couldn't afford to lose. As Rick and Margaret drove back toward Laredo, the weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air. The adrenaline that had fueled them for hours was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep exhaustion mixed with relief. They didn't speak much, but their silence was comfortable, a shared understanding between two people who had faced danger together and come out on the other side. Margaret leaned her head against the window, watching as the Texas landscape blurred past. She thought about Evelyn and Chloe, safe now, but forever changed by what they'd endured. And she thought about Roy, whose quiet strength had been tested to its limits. When they finally arrived at the police station, the Parker family was already there, seated in a small waiting area. Evelyn sat beside Chloe, holding her hand tightly, while Roy paced nearby, his face etched with worry. As Rick and Margaret approached, Roy stopped pacing and turned to them, his expression softening with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "If it weren't for you two," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Rick nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Roy's shoulder. "We're just glad everyone's safe." Inside the interview room, the officers worked quickly, taking detailed statements from each of them. Rick recounted how he and Roy had tracked the kidnappers using Evelyn's phone, emphasizing the urgency of their arrival. Margaret described the chilling moments when Triana and Miguel had confronted them inside the school, her voice steady, despite the lingering fear. Chloe, though visibly shaken, bravely told the officers everything she remembered, her small voice trembling but determined. By the time they finished, it was late into the evening, and the fatigue was palpable. Afterward, the group gathered outside the station, the cool night air offering some relief from the tension of the day. The officer in charge approached them one last time, explaining that Miguel was under arrest and would face multiple charges, including kidnapping and attempted murder. Triana, unfortunately, hadn't survived the confrontation, but her role in the crime would be thoroughly investigated. "We'll also be looking into any connections between her and Carlos Ortiz," the officer added. "It's clear this wasn't a random act. It was planned, and we need to understand why. As the officer walked away, Roy turned to Rick and Margaret, his eyes filled with resolve. "We're leaving Laredo," he announced firmly. "This place, it's not safe for us anymore. Not after all this." Evelyn nodded in agreement, her arm wrapped protectively around Chloe. "We've always known our wealth made us targets, but I never imagined something like this could happen here. We can't risk it." "Not with Chloe." Rick and Margaret exchanged a glance, understanding the weight of Roy's decision. "You have our support," Rick said quietly. "Wherever you go, just make sure you're surrounded by people you trust," Margaret added. "And don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything. You're family now." The next morning, as Rick and Margaret prepared breakfast at home, the events of the previous days still felt surreal. Their quiet retirement had been interrupted by something far beyond what they'd anticipated. Yet they couldn't deny the sense of purpose it had given them. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence. Rick paused, considering the question. "Maybe," he replied. "But even if we don't, we did what we had to do. That's enough." Later that afternoon, they received a call from Roy. The Parkers were heading to a private estate in Colorado, where they hoped to start fresh away from the dangers of Laredo. Before hanging up, Roy thanked them once more, his voice filled with sincerity. "Take care of yourselves," Rick told him, "and keep us updated. We want to know you're settling in okay." As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an ordeal. Rick and Margaret resumed their routines, but the experience had left an indelible mark on them. They found themselves more vigilant, more aware of the world around them, but also more grateful for the simple joys of everyday life. Their bond, already strong, had deepened through the trials they'd faced together. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Margaret broke the silence. "You know, I used to think our adventures were behind us," she said, with a wistful smile. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. To still have a little excitement left in life." Rick chuckled, reaching over to take her hand. "Just promise me we won't run into any more kidnappers anytime soon." They laughed softly, the sound carrying on the gentle breeze. In that moment, surrounded by the peace of their home and the warmth of their connection, they realized something important. No matter how unpredictable life became, they had each other, and that, more than anything, was worth fighting for.